Okay, so this is the Bible study for May 23rd, 2021. We're continuing our Fulfilled series, and this is in John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18, and we're charging on toward the end of the Gospel of John, and obviously have already talked about the crucifixion, and we're in those days after the crucifixion and before the resurrection, and then we're studying today the resurrection. So in chapter 20, verse 1, it says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciple went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken the Lord away, my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you were looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to the Father and your Father, to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. So number one on our Bible study, remember you can download our Bible studies at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And number one says, on what day does this story take place? It says early on the first day of the week while it was still dark. That's what chapter 20, verse 1 says. The second question says, is there any significance or meaning to this? Yes, no, I don't know. And I guess if so, what? So it is important for us to understand this happened on the first day for several reasons. First of all, we know that, remember, this is the time of Passover, and the celebration was to happen. And we talked about this in our Bible studies prior to the crucifixion, that the Jews didn't want to go into Pilate's palace because because they didn't want to become unclean, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover feast. Then the Jews insisted that those that were crucified, including the thieves, be taken down before the Sabbath, so that they weren't up there causing people who passed by to become unclean and that sort of thing. So they broke the legs of the two thieves. But Jesus had already given up his spirit. Jesus was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. Remember, John pointed that out, and that was important. So all of that happened on Friday prior to the Sabbath, prior to sundown on Friday, right? So then the Sabbath happened and the feast, and now this is happening. Remember, the Sabbath was the seventh day, and um, celebrated because on the seventh day God rested from creation, and He's called us also to rest on the seventh day, and that is a Sabbath rest for the people of God, which for those who haven't heard me speak on this before, the Sabbath is not Sunday. The Sabbath is Saturday. It's the seventh day of the week, and the week starts on Sunday. And this happened early on the first day of the week, which is Sunday, which is significant for us because we now celebrate and worship not on the Sabbath, but on Resurrection Day, on the Sunday every week. And so a lot of Christians that I know are ignorant of this truth and mistakenly refer to Sunday as the Sabbath. I guess we can apply principles of Sabbath to Sunday if that's what we want to do. But it is not the original Sabbath. We need to understand that if we're doing that and applying those principles of Sabbath to Sunday, I don't necessarily think that's wrong. I think there's some good thoughts there. But we can't be legalistic about Sunday if we've decided to move the Sabbath around, or the principles, apply the principles of Sabbath to a different day than they were originally intended to be applied to. Then it seems kind of silly for us to get legalistic about our changed way of interpreting Sabbath. Um, so if we're going to decide to do that, I think that's okay. I think there's a good discussion to be had there about how we celebrate Sunday as Resurrection Day, and how we focus on the Lord often on that day, and perhaps rest from our labor on that day, and that makes it Sabbath. But it was not originally the date designated in the law as Sabbath. Okay, so I think the significance of that is recognizing why it is that we do celebrate on Sunday, why it is that we do worship on Sunday. And a lot of modern churches worship and celebrate and meet together on different days, some of them Saturdays, Fridays, Wednesdays. Um, we've met in different ways and at different times pretty much throughout the week on any day of the week. And so I think that's okay too, and I think that's helpful and good. And but the significance of Sunday is that it is Resurrection Day, and I think that still should carry some significance to us. So that's why I think it's significant um, that this happens on the first day of the week, and what that means to us today. So number 2 says, who found the stone rolled away, according to verse 1. So it says that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So Mary Magdalene is the first to see that the stone had been removed. The second part of question 2 says, do you think there's any significance to this? Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. I think people could come up with all kinds of ideas about significance. Mary was somebody who had been shown extraordinary grace, I think, by Jesus. Somebody that perhaps was not the sort of person that Jesus was considered to. The people thought he should have been hanging around, perhaps. Um, And so somebody who is loved by Jesus, considered to have um, been shown extraordinary grace, may have been it may have been reasonable that that person would be the one that most wanted to care for the body of Jesus. Um, but I think another thought is this. Oh, the last the last line of this question is actually a fifth answer. It says, can someone else answer this question? And why are you asking this on every question? Why are you asking, is there significance, or what's the significance on every question? Let me have somebody else answer this question. So in a lot of our Bible studies, different people read different questions, and sometimes people think they always get the hard one. And um, I don't think there's any right answer to this question, but let me tell you what I think is significant. Um, the modern church has largely excluded women from ministry within it. And the Church of the Nazarene believes in women in ministry. We ordain women both as elders and as deacons. And we've done that from the start. That's not a modern thing that we've sort of changed because of the movements that are going on around us in these days. We've done that from the start. It is a decision based on a theological belief that we have about what Scripture says as a whole, and um, that yes, there are some things that Paul says in some of his letters about not letting women speak in church and things like that, but we believe in the plenary interpretation of Scripture and don't believe that certain things should be taken out of context. They need to be left in the context, not necessarily applied broadly to every context. And in that particular situation, the worship in Ephesus was largely prostitute driven and female driven in the temple, of Diana, or Artemis, which actually are both, I believe, the same goddess, um, fertility goddess. But the idea is that some things are meant to be applied in specific situations that we find in Scripture, and some things are intended to be applied more broadly. And being able to, and knowing which ones are which, is important to our interpretation of Scripture. And I know that it gets dangerous when we start talking like this, because people are afraid that we're just going to say, well, that was just for that situation. But there are some things that are applied broadly to several different situations. And one of the ways that we determine which is which is by something that we call the plenary interpretation of Scripture. And that means we don't take one Scripture and build our theology on it. We look at the whole of Scripture and ask ourselves, what does this say about this issue? What does the Bible as a whole say about this issue? And if the Bible as a whole doesn't speak a consistent message on this issue, then perhaps this issue was something that um, could was more specific to the circumstances of the particular situation. And in this case, the case of women in ministry, we find that the whole of Scripture describes many ways in which women were used mightily of God. Both Old Testament and New Testament seem to have been ordained, designated, anointed for particular ministries throughout Scripture. Now, maybe we do not consider them apostles or pastors in a very paternalistic society in Israel. But in many cases, Paul, for instance, used Priscilla and Aquila, and used the home of Lydia to do ministry in and to found a church. And we see many instances in which women were used in ministry. Now, in this case, in this situation, we find that the first gospel messengers, if you will, the first one to proclaim that Jesus was not in his tomb, um, was Mary Magdalene. And so, taken by itself, maybe this wouldn't be something that would be pure justification for ordaining women. But in context of the many other things that we see in Scripture, this is another instance in which Mary became the messenger to the other disciples about what was going on with Jesus. And she became the one who ran up the hill, or I'm not sure if it says down to the tomb, so I've assumed that it's a hill. Maybe those are some of those pictures we imagine in our mind, but she's the first one that went back to where they were staying to tell the disciples, go tell Simon Peter. Then once they all ran down and Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved saw what was to see, then they left again. They went back, and here Mary is alone and seeing Jesus herself. And she goes back to tell the disciples what Jesus told her to tell them. So Jesus anointed her the messenger of this message that he has not yet ascended, and tell them what I'm going to do. Tell them what is happening. And so Jesus ordained her as the messenger of um, of of his resurrection, of his coming ascension. And so this is something that, within context of the rest of the Scripture, is one more thing that reminds us of how Jesus used and called women to service within his church and amongst his disciples. So I think that's significant. Now, you may think that I'm stretching there, and that's okay. If you think that I'm stretching it a little bit, go back and read about the times um, in the book of Acts when Paul uses women in ministry as a part of his ministry. Go back and look at how Jesus interacts with women. Go back and look at how God used certain women, including Esther, and including the prostitute, um, and including um, Ruth, and how significant these are in the Scriptures. Um, anyway, there are plenty of other examples if you think this is a stretch of how God uses women, and this is not the thing that I'm building my theology on, but this is another scripture that shows us a woman who is specifically tasked and sent by Jesus with a message, and I think we can say the gospel message, a good news message to his other disciples who did not yet see what was going on. So, number 3 says, what did Mary believe had happened according to verse 2? A, he is risen. Um, don't we wish that's what she believed from the start? But that isn't what she believed. B, everything is just as he told us it would be. No, and we wish that was true too. But C is true. Her first take on this was, someone has taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put them. That's what she tells the other disciples. That's what she tells the man that she thought was the gardener. Just tell me where you've put him. If you took him, tell me. I'll go get him. Um, Number 4, who according to verse 2 did she tell? A, nobody. So verse 2 says, so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said. So nobody, B, everybody. Neither one of those is true according to this scripture. C, she likely ran to tell the most respected and active leaders amongst the disciples, or maybe just the closest. D, Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. So D is straight out of the scripture. C is a little bit of interpretation. We don't know whether she considered them to be leaders amongst the disciples, although a lot of what we read would suggest that they probably were. Certainly Peter, James, and John seem to have been close to Jesus and leaders among the disciples. Um, but maybe she just ran and talked to the ones that were the closest. We don't really know. They are the ones that seem to hang around the longest. Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved seem to have been stayed the closest throughout the event. They are the ones that followed Jesus um, to the temple courts or the high priest's area. Um, for the trial. And so maybe everybody else scattered, but they were the closest still around. Number 5, what did they do when they heard what Mary had to say, according to verses 3 through 5? So it says, so Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. So A, they told her to calm down and dismissed her words, which is what we might have expected somebody to say or do to a woman in that paternalistic society, but it is not what they did. B, they headed for the tomb. It says they started for the tomb, like it was an immediate response. They believed Mary. They went to see what was going on for themselves. Then C, they ran out to see what Mary had told them about. So this is true. Number 6, what did they find when they got to the tomb, according to verses 6 through 9? That says, then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw strips of linen. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So A, Mary had imagined everything. That is not true. That's not what they found. B, the linens that had wrapped Jesus' body were laying in place. Notice it doesn't say that they were folded in this text. It says they were laying in their place. So what that means is the body linens that were wrapped were laying where the body had been, and the head linens was where the head had been, and that's what it says to us, separate. The cloth that was around the head, separate from the linen, laying in the place. So almost as if Jesus had sort of just passed through and out of them, and they stayed right where they should have been. And unlike what it might have looked like if somebody had taken the body and unwrapped them and tossed them who knows where, or folded them up nicely. And so this is something that John thinks is significant to the story. C, the body had not just been moved, but the strips of linen and cloth that wrapped Jesus' body had been removed and left in the tomb. So that's not what you would expect if somebody was going to move a body, that they would unwrap them from the linen. You would expect that they would leave it all together and move the body. So That makes us question the story that Mary originally believed, which is that the body had been moved. Makes us think something else is going on here. Number 7, what does verse 8 tell us happened when the disciple whom Jesus loved entered the tomb? So it says, finally, the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. How do we know that he believed? Well, most of us believe that the disciple whom Jesus loved, the beloved disciple, is the Apostle John, who wrote this. So, how do we know that he believed? Well, at that moment, the writer is basically telling us this was enough for me to believe that he had raised from the dead, or perhaps it means this was enough for me to believe that he really wasn't there. I don't know, but I think there's a deeper meaning in this, that at that moment he believed that Jesus had been telling them something that they weren't really hearing, they weren't really listening to, and now I get it. Um, Different. Um, it says they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Maybe they still didn't understand in context what the theology of all this was and what he was supposed to be doing, but they were beginning to understand, and he believed that Jesus was doing something very significant here, more than he had imagined. Number 8, what happened when the disciples left, according to verses 10 through 15? A, Mary stayed. She did. B, Mary wept. She did. C, Mary saw 2 angels in the tomb who asked her why she was crying and who she was looking for. So that is interesting because it is not in this text. D, Mary saw Jesus and initially thought he was the gardener. Um, and so uh, so D is what is right in this text, A, B, and D. Now, the story that's told in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, and specifically in verse 4, tells of perhaps more than one woman that went down to see the tomb and saw that it was rolled away and didn't find the body of Jesus. And verse 4 of chapter 24 in Luke says they didn't know what to make of this. Suddenly, 2 men were standing beside them in gleaming bright clothing. The women were frightened and bowed their faces toward the ground, but the men said to them, why do you look for the living among the dead? Um, so in the Gospel of Luke, it seems that the multiple ladies that were there had saw 2 men who it seems might have been angels that were there trying to tell the women. Um, Now, some people really struggle with how the differences in the different accounts in Scripture, and might try to suggest that calls into question their authenticity. I would suggest that there are a whole lot of events in my life that I absolutely know happened. But when I hear my wife tell the story, or my parents tell the story, or my sister tell the story sounds different when each of us tell it. And we remember different things. Some of the things we remember may be uh, not quite as accurate as we wish they had been if we had a video record of it. Um, but the fact that the event happened, and the fact that the words were said, and those things are the most important part of it. So one of the things that I would say, and I'm finding myself telling you a lot about the Nazarene article of faith on the Holy Scriptures, in this Bible study. You can go back and look at that in our manual or up on the Nazarene website, nazarene.org. But what you'll find is that, yes, we believe in the plenary interpretation of Scripture. We also don't believe in inerrancy of Scripture in the same way that many sort of fundamentalist churches might believe. Our belief about the Scripture is not that it is inerrant, period, but that it inerrantly reveals everything necessary for salvation. And so what that means is that we allow for human error in the record and in the storytelling, but believe that God was a part of it all when it was being written down, and that we have everything that we need for salvation. So the truth of Scripture in the matters that are necessary for salvation is completely all that it needs to be. But that doesn't mean that the stories don't differ slightly based on the perspective of the writer. So some Christians and some churches believe that God Himself, by His Spirit, or perhaps even standing next to the writers of Scripture, basically dictated word for word what must be written down. And if that was the case, then why would God dictate errors or you know things that didn't necessarily agree to each other? And so people that believe that, if they're going to hold on to the inerrancy of Scripture, must believe that in many cases, like there was, was there one demoniac or two demoniacs, or, well, maybe these were two different stories entirely. That gets a little more tricky when you get to the resurrection, because you start asking, could there have been more than one resurrection? No, that can't happen. So then you got to try to decide, how many times did women show up that morning? And you have to try to sort of explain away these inconsistencies between the Gospels. And our understanding of Scripture in the Church of the Nazarene allows for us to not have to explain these things away, for us to be able to say, we believe that these events happened. We believe that humans wrote this down inspired by God. And we believe that it is possible that mistaken memories and errors found their way into the text, but that God has watched over the creation of the text that we have today in such a way that those errors really don't change the point of the story, and they don't change our understanding of salvation. And so we have all that we need to understand what is necessary for salvation. Um, and so that's an important part of our understanding of Scripture. It comes out in this little sort of differences in this story between John's gospel and Luke's gospel. Number 9 says, what happened when Jesus spoke Mary's name, according to verse 16? So verse 16 says, Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. So you can write down that whole part of the verse if you want. But ultimately, what happened when he said her name was that she suddenly recognized him for who he was. Not the gardener, but Jesus, her teacher, her rabbi. And then the second part of question 9 says, do you recognize the voice of Jesus calling your name? Scripture says, Jesus said that his sheep know his voice. And there's something about how God speaks to us, how Jesus calls us and speaks to us, that we ought to know his voice, and we ought to know when he's calling our name. And there may be times when we have trouble recognizing him because we didn't expect to see him. She expected him to be lying there dead. When he was gone from the tomb, she expected that he was lying somewhere else dead. Why would you recognize Jesus in this glorified body? Um, but now he spoke her name and she recognized him, not because of what he looked like, but because of how he spoke to her. And we also ought to be able to recognize Jesus in that same way. Number 10 says, what did Mary do after she spoke to Jesus? According to verse 18, it says, Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. So she went and declared the gospel. I have seen the Lord. He's risen. Um, is this news this important and exciting to you? So one of the things that's most troubling to me in the church is how many people say that they have been saved by the blood, the grace, the power of Jesus Christ, um, but do not seem to be all that excited about it, do not seem to be interested in sharing the news, even though Jesus has specifically told us to. And so it's troubling to me because I don't think we have to go out and say, oh, Jesus said, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Oh, I guess I have to. I don't feel like we should have to do that. I feel like if we've really come in contact with the risen Christ, if we've really been radically saved and transformed by his grace and his love and his power, then I don't think we should have to be commanded or pushed to share that news. It ought to be a joy to us to go share with those that we love the news that should be good news to them as well, and definitely is good news to us. She thought he was dead, but now she sees that he lives, and that's good news to her. And she goes and shares it. She was told to, so have we been. But I don't believe we do things very well just because we're told. It doesn't track with what I've seen among humans and in the church. But I do believe when we're excited about something and when it matters to us, we get very quick to talk about it and to share it. And so, one of my biggest things that I'm so troubled by in the church is how few people share the gospel, the good news. And that makes me believe not that we're not very good at doing what we're told, because I already know that, but it makes me believe that we're not all that excited about the gospel and what he's done in our lives, which makes me wonder if we've really experienced what he came to do, the good news in our lives.